Crackanory, Too Cracked for TV. Kill Phil by Ali Crockett and David Scott. Read by Robert Bathurst.
Phil Prescott was one of those people who thought the world was out to get him. Which is dangerous these days when a persecution complex can be aggravated online. And Phil pretty much spent all day, every day, cyber-spying on his colleagues, convinced they were about to shaft him, or trolling businesses he felt personally shafted by. Luckily, Phil had a mild-mannered and saintly girlfriend, Mona, who was always on hand to chill him out after he'd spilt a boiling hot cappuccino all over his legs. One day, Phil applied for a more senior role at the council offices where he worked. Graham, the self-titled Facilitator of Equality and Inclusivity, an Owen Jones-type social justice warrior who looked like an overgrown 12-year-old, would be leading his interview alongside the two Susans from HR. Phil prepared well for the interview. He studied what all the right things to say that week were, and which topics to bang on about at length. He even forked out to have his best non-patriarchal suit taken to Mr. Polycarkis, the dry cleaners. All seemed to be going well at the interview, until the very last moment, when Phil stood up too briskly, and his trouser fly, which Mr. Polycarkis had promised to fix, suddenly failed. Not such a bad thing, had he selected a nice retentive pair of fitted trunks, but that day he was wearing his lucky, or perhaps not so lucky, boxers, a voluminous pair with a button missing. Without going into detail, the status of the Human Resources Office as a safe place in which anything could be aired was challenged by Phil in the most pointed terms. Suffice to say, instead of giving Phil the job, Graham gave him the sack. Whether Phil's wardrobe malfunction or attitude lost him his job, we'll never know. But in Phil's mind, the only person to blame was Mr. Polycarkis. After a confidence-boosting gasp on his inhaler, Phil angrily confronted his ennemi de jour, but the dry cleaner was having none of it and sent Phil packing. "Get out of my shop, you crazy weirdo, and don't ever show your face here again, or I'll wrap a coat hanger around your neck." Instead of recovering from this setback, Phil stewed and stewed. Mona tried everything to lift his mood, but her boyfriend had fallen into a funk deeper than George Clinton playing slap bass in a quarry. Mona grew so concerned for Phil, she even suggested they move out of the city. She'd recently been offered a job cleaning the kitchens at a vast digital warehouse in the sticks. Phil didn't just pooh-pooh the idea, he shat all over it. Village life. Marrow-growing competitions and incest. No thanks. And with that, Phil booted up his laptop, which he hoped would be a signal for Mona to shut down her gob. Phil had a problem. His problem was that he thought Mr. Polycarkis was the problem. And as with most of life's problems, the solution was out there on the internet. Dry cleaner revenge. Carrying out on. Best way of. What is? Phil typed into Google, willfully ignoring all laws of syntax. Astoundingly, no one had ever asked this specific question of the hive mind. Phil was about to give up when a post on Mumsnet talked about the existence of an app designed by a hacker called Pirate Fred, devoted to revenge. The app, called Criss Cross, could only be accessed, however, through the dark web. If the internet was a nice, clean carpet, the dark web was the grotty underlay which one shudders to think about. Using an obscure web browser, used solely by meth cooks, jihadists and techno-nonces, Phil soon found himself at the Criss-Cross login page. Let me for a moment describe to you a show on TV in the 1970s called Swap Shop, hosted by haircut-turned-presenter Noel Edmonds. Children would ring in to post toys, which they no longer wanted, on a message board, while requesting toys of a similar value in exchange. Out of the kindness of his own ego, Edmonds would match up children with corresponding toys and facilitate the exchange. You might be wondering what this has to do with Criss-Cross. Well, the app worked rather like Swap Shop, except that it wasn't space hoppers being swapped for Scalextrics, but the carrying out of crimes against other people. A user in Croydon might want somebody to go kick their enemy in the nuts, and in exchange be happy to put superglue in the mascara of another user's enemy in Cape Town. Crisscross helped these exchanges happen. Lack of connection between perpetrators and their targets meant the crimes were untraceable. But here's the very clever thing. Crisscross was also a marketplace. If a user wanted someone bumped off, they wouldn't necessarily have to perform the same act for Crisscross, but could carry out a multitude of other smaller crimes up to the same value. Well, Phil thought, he'd be happy to drop litter in some random person's garden 20 times if it meant Mr. Polycarkis's shop was suddenly put out of business by a targeted flood of sewage. Phil quickly clicked through the app's various installation pages, blithely agreeing to unread pages of contract, as if he were installing a bundle of print drivers. As soon as he was authenticated, he flagged Mr. Polycarkis as the target, and then went to the app's drop-down menu of crimes. His overworked computer, choked with useless software, had a terrible lag which caused Phil to click buttons on parts of the screen yet to load. Instead of selecting Mr. Polycarkis to be the subject of malicious hacking that would cause his dry-cleaning machine to spin out of control, Phil accidentally clicked on Assassination. Ah! Phil spent the next 20 minutes Control-Zing, Control-Alt-deleting, and uncontrollably swearing. But he couldn't undo what he'd done. Then Phil tried to find the phone number on the website to cancel the hit. But in this respect, Crisscross was like any of its legitimate big business cousins. There was no number on the website. Ah! Phil legged it to the dry cleaners and spent the next few days watching over Mr. Polycarkis, hoping to protect him. But something had to give, and that thing was Phil's bladder. In the end, Phil nipped to the nearest pub, but when he returned, Mr. Polycarkis was killed in front of him, squashed by a dry-cleaning machine pushed on top of him. "No!" thought Phil. "Why me? Why's everyone got it in for me?" Then he scarpered. Back home, Phil opened Crisscross and saw the single figure of one murder in the debit column. What had he done? Then, to clear it, he saw that he'd need to enact equivalent 500 mini-acts of maliciousness. Phil shuddered. In the grip of fear, he deleted the app, destroyed all trace of his online life, and gave his laptop a right kicking. Now what? Thought Phil, before deciding maybe Mona was right. Maybe they did need to get out of the city for a while. Within a week, Phil and Mona were installed in an upmarket village in a rundown cottage. Mona took up her new job, while Phil stayed in and did up their new home. And as time passed, it appeared Phil had got away with murder. In fact, as the fear and guilt subsided, he began to reassess his life. When he trod on a nail or banged his thumb with a hammer, he realized that maybe there was no one to blame but himself. And bizarrely, that made him feel better. Phil was also feeling the benefit of staying off the internet. So much so, he decided to write a digital detox book about the benefit of staying off the internet. Phil was the most chipper he'd ever been, whereas Mona, who, remember, had suggested the change of scenery, was starting to live up to her name. Each day Mona seemed to have more to complain about. Her wellies springing a leak, the garden flowers getting trampled on, the vicar's bike running over her foot. Phil rationalized to Mona that the new countryside lifestyle would take a while to get used to, but his mind was more on finishing his book, and finish it he did. However, when months later he opened his email account so he could send out the manuscript to publishers, he saw a worrying message from a very cross Crisscross. According to their terms and conditions, Phil had reneged on his side of the deal and had been flagged as a non-payer. The email explained that if he continued to make no effort to settle his debt, Phil and, as the small print had made very clear but exceedingly small, those close to him would become a target for the whole Crisscross network. Crimes would start small but get increasingly violent if he didn't pay up. Then Phil noticed with horror the message was dated a month ago. Maybe the maypole that crashed into Mona's windscreen that morning wasn't a random accident. It was Crisscross. The next day Phil tried to exact as many petty hits as he could to get back in the black on his crisscross account. He kicked over 14 wheelie bins, kidnapped 4 gnomes, and purposefully sneezed in an estate agent's face. But as he opened the crisscross app when he got home, Phil saw his efforts were too little, too late. By not putting back into crisscross's society of vengeance, either by committing a murder or a whole load of lesser crimes, Phil's original liability had been accruing interest and was now at a huge 500,000 misdeeds. To pay off his debt to Crisscross, he would have to do something verging on a war crime. Phil knew the time had come to do what no man ever wants to do, share his recent internet history with his girlfriend. He told Mona everything. "I'm so sorry, love, putting you in this terrible situation, when all you've ever done is support me." Mona, who was playing solitaire at the time, didn't shout or scream or indeed say anything, although, unbeknownst to Phil, she did crush 2 marbles to dust in her hand. "So what's done is done. But what are we going to do, Mona? Hun? Darling? Please say something." Finally Mona spoke. "I'm going back to work, Phil." "What?" "And you're coming with me. The only way to end this madness is to discover the creator of Crisscross and get them to take the site down. And for that, we'll need the supercomputers at the digital warehouse." "Well, maybe that could work. Oh, thanks, darling. You might have just saved my life." "Our lives, Phil. Remember the small print? And the maypole." "Sorry, love. I really don't deserve such kindness after all that I've done. Truly, you're an angel." "Get in the boot," ordered Mona, non-angelically. 20 minutes later, Phil and Mona arrived at her work, Phil secreted in the trunk of their car. Once inside the facility, Phil gained access to the supercomputers. Utilizing the awesome processing power of the hardware, Phil's old persecution-fueled online detection skills came flooding back to him. He searched and searched through the night, through layer after layer of encryption, until finally he tracked down Pirate Fred's IP address. Result. Phil and Mona got back in her car, punched Newbury into the sat-nav, and set off on a last-minute road trip. Yes, Newbury. For the next 3 hours, various motorists seemed to threaten their lives, but Phil and Mona managed to stay sane by convincing each other they were probably just being paranoid. I mean, no one would really try to kill them. That was until a breeze block dropped from an overhead bridge, narrowly missing their back bumper. The couple eventually arrived at Pirate Fred's lair, a bungalow in Berkshire. There was no answer at the front door, so they went to the back garden and let themselves in. There they found Pirate Fred in his bedroom, playing a video game and wearing headphones. The 11-year-old boy looked up at Mona and Phil. "Are you my new flute teacher?" he asked Phil. Pirate Fred, or Kieran, as his family and school friends knew him, was indeed the creator of Crisscross. He explained that, inspired by his father's tale of a mythical TV program called Swap Shop, he created Crisscross as a kind of digital Noel Edmonds for exchanging toys. Of late, Pirate Fred had left Crisscross to work away online, powered by its own artificial intelligence, while he prepared for his sats. In his absence, Crisscross, like its TV host counterpart, had become a force of evil. Its AI homed in on the true nature of humanity and had pivoted, redesigning itself to satisfy man's desire for violence and revenge. Pirate Fred switched screens to the Crisscross admin page, and looking back at Phil, Mona and the boy was a real-time database of 100,000 vengeful users. 100,000? Wow, said Pirate Fred proudly. "And they're all out to get me," whispered Phil, almost in awe. "Us," corrected Mona, her forehead manifesting a freshly visible throbbing vein. The couple heard vehicles pulling up. They rushed to the front room and peeked through the curtains, where they saw a growing army of crisscrossers staring first at their phones, then at the various houses in the cul-de-sac. Phil and Mona had tried to travel incognito, but they couldn't avoid being spotted by cameras or facial recognition systems watched over by Criss-Cross. The users outside were drawn like a pack of dogs to a digital pheromone trail left by the couple's journey to find Pirate Fred. "There they are!" cried an eagle-eyed Criss-Crosser, seeing the couple at the window. Splat! An egg hit the bungalow front door. "OK, I think you need to leave now," said Pirate Fred. A turd came through the letterbox. "Not until you close down, Criss-Cross," Phil demanded. "It's sick." "Yeah, sick in a mega-cool way, and breaking news, you're not my parents. Now get out before I call the police." And with that, the boy returned to his room, his earphones, and his video game. But some policemen were already nearby. Outside, in fact, preparing Molotov cocktails, their faces criss-crossed in anger. Spotting this, Mona finally flipped. She ran into Pirate Fred's bedroom and slammed him against his Cheryl coal-cupboard wall. "Listen, you little sea dweeby. These Criss-Crosses will stop at nothing to destroy us, so they'll destroy your parents' house, too." Pirate Fred had already been grounded that week for not brushing his teeth, so the idea of what his parents would do if he'd obliterated their bungalow was indeed troubling. So he pulled the plug on Criss-Cross. But it remained online, refusing to obey its creator. It had gone to the cloud. Wherever it could be shut down, it would reappear like a virtual game of whack-a-mole. Criss-Cross, like Pirate Fred's acne, was completely out of control. Suddenly, some Criss-Crossers started getting in through the back door. While the child and her man-child wet themselves, Mona set about the invaders with a handy toy lightsaber. She attacked them with such ferocity it was almost like she was channeling 10 years of anger at Phil. Actually, it was exactly like that, and she successfully beat the intruders back into the garden and locked the door shut. Phil, panicking, suddenly felt a desperate need for his inhaler. As he rustled in his pockets, he pulled out a scrap of paper. It was the dry-cleaning receipt from Mr. Polycarkis. There was no mention of the trouser repair job on the tiny slip of paper. Phil hadn't ever asked Mr. P to fix his flies. Criss-Crossers were now ramming the front door, back door, and were all over the roof. One nearly got through the French windows, but Mona lamped her with a lamp. The trio retreated to the bathroom, where Phil explained his mistake. How his shame at being exposed in front of Graham, not forgetting the two Susans, was all his own fault. "What? Are you kidding me?" said Mona, and smacked Phil full-on in the face with a soap dish. Then she caught a glimpse of her snarling face in the mirror and wailed, "Look what you've turned me into!" Mona broke down in tears, and Phil felt shame like he'd never felt before. Well, not since his little Philip flopped out at the job interview. But then an idea dawned on Phil. Shame had got him into this. Maybe shame might get him out. Quicker than it takes to say Control-C, Control-V, share, at Phil's behest, Pirate Fred got out his phone and leaked the identities of every Criss-Cross user to every relevant social platform and Google+. Phil hoped by throwing light on the users of the dark web he could shame them into no longer using Criss-Cross. As kicks and punches rained down on the bathroom door, the info spread online. After a few minutes, the banging began to peter out, and then cease entirely. The Criss-Crossers could be heard grumbling, shuffling out of the house to their cars and driving away. "Yes, it worked," said Phil, sticking his head out of the door, then punching the air, the first punch he'd thrown that day. Not exactly," corrected Pirate Fred, checking his mobile. "What's taken Criss-Cross down is 1 billion people clicking on the app trying to register." It was true. When the light web, or as it's otherwise known, every twat, heard about Criss-Cross, they all wanted to sign up, which had forced the app to crash. And without Criss-Cross telling the Criss-Crossers what to do, they all did one. After a long, long holiday, Phil and Mona returned to the countryside. Phil's book became a hit, and eventually the couple were married. Phil had learnt from his adventure that he was better off offline, and as long as Criss-Cross went on his case, no one was really out to get him. so there was no reason to be scared of anyone, except, maybe, of his wife.